The City and Its Uncertain Walls, the new book by Haruki Murakami, coming out today, or at least today is the release date. I pre-ordered mine on the internet, and it just kind of happened to arrive at my door almost an entire week before the release date. So I don't know if everybody got theirs early or if mine was just a complete freak accident, but I am not about to complain about that. I was so thrilled when it showed up. I literally dropped everything I was doing, stopped reading my book that I was currently reading, and immediately opened Haruki Murakami's. If you haven't by chance read a book by Haruki Murakami, he writes books in the genre of magical realism. Everything in it just feels a little bit strange, a little bit off. It feels like you're walking through a dream as you're reading the book. The rules of reality don't really apply when you're reading a Haruki Murakami book. Anything can happen at any time. All of the characters just act a little strange, a little bit weird, a little bit off. No one really acts like they would in real life. Then the world itself that these characters exist in is just a little bit off. And then the world will be shifting and changing, and the rules of the world itself will be changing as you go through the book. Nothing is solid. Nothing is tangible. This particular book then is about a middle-aged man looking back on his life. And he's going to look back on the time when he was 17 years old and he fell in love with a girl who was 16. And this girl then tells him about this city, the city with uncertain walls. And in this city that is surrounded by this wall, there is a gatekeeper who strictly controls who is allowed into this city. This city then has these magical beasts that roam inside and outside the city that are unicorns. And in order to enter the city, you must first give up your shadow. The girl also tells him, if you want to be there, you can meet me there, but you must truly want to be there. Then she disappears, and he will spend the rest of his life trying to figure out how he can get to this city with the uncertain walls. At a certain point in the book, our main character will also move to a small town in the mountains, and he will take over as head librarian from a kindly old man who just might be more than he appears to be at first glance. And I really don't want to say any more about the plot than that, because I really don't want to spoil anything that happens in this book. Although, to be honest, I could probably lay it out for you, like plot beat by plot beat, because the plot doesn't really matter. Actually, to be honest, the plot doesn't normally matter in a Haruki Murakami book. That's not the point. What really matters is the story, what the story has to say, what it has to say about feelings and human nature, what it has to say about who we are and where we belong. How do we know where we belong? Do we know where we belong? And if we're there, would we even know? Then, what if we're wrong? And if we are wrong, can we take it back? Then if you've read Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World, a lot of what I said describing the premise of this book is going to sound familiar to you. Because technically, this is the third time that Haruki Murakami has written this story. He first wrote it as a novella that was published in a magazine that he would never allow to be printed anywhere else. And he wrote this when he was young, before he was ever an author. Then he felt like that should be a book. So he wrote Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World, where he turned that novella into half of the book, that half being the end of the world. Then, as he got towards the end of his life, he came up with this idea to rewrite the story one last time, but this time as a full, complete 450-page book based solely on that idea of that town. This is this book. And actually, this book is written in 3 parts, part 1, 2, and 3. And part 1 is really essentially a retelling of that novella, or a retelling of that half of Hard-Boiled Wonderland, told from a different angle and in a different perspective, in a much different way. But as you're going through part 1 of this, if you've read Hard-Boiled Wonderland, you're going to notice a lot of plot beats. You'll pretty much know where it's going and how it's going to get there. And then once part 1 ends, it completely moves into a whole new area and in a whole new way, and has a whole new conversation built solely on the back of part 1, or the story that we all know, if at least I knew because I read Hard-Boiled Wonderland, I want to say last year or the year before, and I didn't even know that this book was on its way. I'm so glad that the very last Haruki Murakami book that I personally read before picking this up was Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World, because it just so beautifully transitions into this. They are both extensions of a story that he originated as a young man, and not that this replaces Hard-Boiled Wonderland. That's not the case at all. It really sits alongside of it as an extension of that conversation. And boy, oh boy, is it wonderful, and I loved every second of it. I'm not even going to pretend that I didn't like this more than Hard-Boiled Wonderland, because I 100% did. This was by far my preferred version of that story and my preferred version of that experience. Not that Hard-Boiled Wonderland is a bad book by any stretch of the imagination. I love that book. I love pretty much every book Haruki Murakami's ever written, but this one has something to it that other one did not. There is a touching nuance, a thread that runs through this that I just connected with so deeply, and I loved every second of it. It's almost like there was something that he was trying to say when he was younger. He had his hands on something, but he couldn't quite figure out what it was or how he was supposed to say it. And as he got older, he realized that there was more to this story. And then the reflective nature of this book, with the main character who's constantly reflecting not only back on his life, but reflecting on where he is and where he's supposed to be at any given time, is just so powerful. And then on top of all of that, this is one of the most restrained books that I have ever read by Haruki Murakami. All of the weird, trippy stuff that he's normally got going on in his books, albeit here, is dialed way back. The world itself feels just a little bit more tangible, a little bit more realistic, maybe a little bit less fluid than it normally is. The rules of this particular book and the reality inside of it feels like you could really pin it down if you had to. Like, reality itself in his books is like this moving target that you can never quite get a hold of. You can never quite grasp. You can't really nail it down at any point in any of his books. But this is one that feels like if you really had to, you could actually define the world and the rules of it, which is very different for a Murakami book. Then there's all the Murakami-isms. And if you've read one, you know what I'm talking about. There's a literal bingo card that people have made that you can check off as you're reading the book, because you're always going to find the exact same things popping up in every single book. It's kind of like a Tom Cruise movie. You're going to have Tom Cruise running. It's kind of like that. It's really become a meme at this point. But anyway, the Murakami-isms are really dialed back and toned down in this book. They are there, but he kind of briefly mentions them and moves on, almost like he's aware of the bingo card, and he just kind of tosses them out there so that you can check them off as he goes along. He knows that it's a meme at this point. He knows what it is. He knows who he is as a writer, and he knows his reputation. So he goes ahead and he throws them in there, but it's almost like he just kind of casually mentions them and then moves on with the story. Unlike normal, where it's like you're being bombarded at all times and he's really firing on all cylinders and just really kind of bombastic and in your face. That isn't this. Instead, he really focuses his time in this book on reflection, reflecting on life, reflecting on the past, and you can really feel his age in this book. It really feels like an older man looking back, reflecting on his life and his career and everything that's come before. And then on top of that, there's this real strong feeling of melancholy that runs through the core of this book, way more so than his other books. There is normally a feeling of melancholy in his books, but this is much more potent. And then the fun, playful, lively, crazy characters are dialed down too. There's a real strong sense of the main character discovering and accepting who he is and where he belongs. And then sometimes where you belong might change over time. Sometimes you might be the true, genuine version of yourself. Sometimes you might be just a mere shadow of yourself. And sometimes the mere shadow of yourself can be more real than the real version of you. And sometimes you might need your shadow to show you the way and where you're really supposed to be, because you're over here holding on to something and it's really time to let go. And it's just so touching and so soft spoken and so poignant. And like I said, it's like walking through a dream, and the dream is just, oh my gosh, it's so warm and inviting, and it's just so magical. The world is magical. The writing is magical. Murakami is magical. And all of his books are like that. This is actually the 6th book of his that I have read, and I'm going to put it right at the top of the list, up there with 1Q84 and the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, because it's just that good. Not that any of his books are bad, because the other books that I've read of his are Norwegian Wood, Kafka on the Shore, and the Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World, and they are all magical. They are all fantastic, but I'm going to put this right at the top. 1Q84 is probably still the best of the best of the best. This will sit right alongside of Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, because it's just, it's just so wonderful. It's just so magical. Like I said, just a little bit more subdued than his other works, but geez, oh Pete's, if they're not just some of the greatest. I love it. I love it. I'm so happy that I got this. I'm so happy that I got to read it, and I just lived in this world for several days, and I'm all the better for it. My life is better for it. I just love everything about it. I'm going to give it a 9.5 out of 10. It actually might eventually sit as a 10 out of 10. I kind of feel like I want to call it a 10, but I can't bring myself to do it. I literally just finished it last night, and I need to sit on it for a little bit more before I say that this is like a perfect 10 of a book. But damn it, if it isn't, it's really close. For the sake of this video, I'm going to label it a 9.5. As always, everybody, the link for my Patreon's in the description below. The link for my Discord's in the description below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.